In the last video, we've already talked about how utility or the utility function of the consumer affects his demand curve. And we talked about how a price change actually affects the quantity demand of the consumer. And so on this graph, where our vertical axis is the price of good one and our horizontal axis is the quantity of good one, we can actually draw a line that shows or that represents our demand curve. And we see that our demand curve is downward sloping because as price increases, as the price of good one increases, the quantity demanded for good one decreases. In this video, what we'll be talking about is what happens when the price of good 2 rather than good 1, what happens when the price of good 2 changes, and what happens when the budget of the consumer changes as well. So, the first thing we have to remember is that there are actually two kinds of goods that the consumer buys. The first is inferior goods and the second are normal goods. So, normal goods are, as we know, normal goods. And a good example for this is the good or expensive cup of coffee we get from a coffee shop. So let's say that a student buys coffee every other day to save his money. So he buys coffee every other day, but now let's say that his budget or his allowance actually increases. This time he has more money to spend on his coffee, and so he can now afford to buy coffee or to drink coffee every day rather than every other day. So in this aspect, in this perspective, the demand curve of the student who buys coffee actually shifts to the right. So he'd have a new demand curve over here. And this shows that now at the same price point, let's set a P1 prime here. At the same price point, he now consumes more of good one than before. So from x1 prime here, he now consumes at x double prime because of his increase in allowance or increase in budget. On the other hand, what if this student relies only on instant coffee? If the student relies on instant coffee and he gets an allowance increase, he might actually substitute or decrease his consumption of instant coffee and switch to Starbucks. So in this case, we consider the instant coffee of the student as an inferior good. And as we talked about a while ago, when the student gets more allowance or more budget for coffee, he substitutes or he buys more Starbucks and less of this instant coffee. So if the student's allowance or budget increases, his demand curve actually shifts to the left. And the reason for this is because the instant coffee that the student consumes in this case is actually an inferior good. Now, a clarification that has to be made is sometimes a luxury good for one person or a normal good for one person can actually be an inferior good to another person. So this is a case-to-case basis, and we can't really compare two people for this. So again, if the consumer is consuming normal goods, the demand curve could shift to the right, which means he would consume more of that good as his budget increases. However, if the good that the consumer buys is actually an inferior good, then his budget curve or his demand curve actually shifts to the left as his budget increases. Now, let me draw another graph on the right side here. And now we'll be talking about the change in price of the other good. So here we again have x sub 1 and here we have P1. And again, we draw this demand curve right here. So the initial reaction when, for example, there is an increase in the price of good 2, we think that the quantity consumed for good 1 would increase because good 2 is now more expensive than good 1. This may be the case, especially when the two goods, good 1 and good 2, are both substitutes of each other, meaning good 1 can actually replace the utility lost from good 2. So if both of these goods are substitutes of each other, then our demand curve would shift to the right when the price of good 2 increases. But what about if the two goods were actually kind of complements to each other? For example, ice creams and ice cream and cones. So if ice cream becomes more expensive, you might not buy cones anymore. So let's say that our good 1 are cones is cone, and our good 2 are ice cream is ice cream. So we see that if the price of ice cream increases, then we'd buy less of ice cream, and since our ice cream cones complement the ice cream, then we would also demand less of ice cream cones. So in this case, the price increase in good 2 decreases or shifts our demand curve to the left. And again, if the two goods are substitutes, a price increase of the other good shifts our demand curve to the right, which means that the goods are actually substitutes. However, when the price increase actually shifts our demand curve to the left, or the price increase of the other good shifts our demand curve to the left, then they are actually considered as complements.